The year was 1692, and Captain Bartholomew Blackwood had seen enough blood and thunder to fill a dozen lifetimes. But nothing in his 20 years of Caribbean piracy had prepared him for what emerged from the mists off the coast of Hispaniola that October morning. What began as a routine raid on Spanish treasure ships would become the most terrifying naval encounter in recorded history, pitting hardened buccaneers against an enemy that defied every law of nature and warfare. The Caribbean in the late 17th century was a cauldron of violence, greed, and supernatural dread. Spanish galleons heavy with New World gold navigated treacherous waters, patrolled by English privateers, French corsairs, and bloodthirsty pirates who answered to no flag but their own. But beneath the surface of this maritime chaos, something far more sinister was stirring. Ancient forces that had slumbered in the deepest trenches of the Caribbean Sea were awakening, drawn to the surface by the endless spilling of blood upon the waves. From the surviving journal of Captain Blackwood, recovered from a sealed chest buried on Tortuga, we have this chilling account. The morning began like any other hunt. My ship, the Crimson Vengeance, had been stalking a Spanish treasure fleet for 3 days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. We were a crew of 43 souls, each one a veteran of countless raids, men who had stared death in the face and laughed. But the laughter would die in our throats before the sun reached its peak. The Spanish fleet consisted of 4 vessels, 3 escort frigates protecting a single treasure galleon, the Santa Isabella, which our intelligence suggested carried enough gold and silver to make every man aboard wealthy beyond his wildest dreams. Standard tactics called for a swift, coordinated attack, overwhelming the escorts before they could organize a proper defense, then boarding the treasure ship for close-quarters combat. It should have been routine work for experienced pirates. But as the Crimson Vengeance closed distance with its prey, the very sea itself began to change. The water, which had been the familiar turquoise blue of Caribbean waters, gradually darkened to an unnatural black. The temperature dropped so suddenly that breath became visible in the tropical air. Most disturbing of all, the waves began moving in patterns that defied wind and current, forming geometric shapes that hurt the eyes to look upon. According to Blackwood's journal, his crew initially attributed these phenomena to unusual weather conditions. The Caribbean was notorious for sudden storms that could appear without warning, transforming calm seas into deadly maelstroms within minutes. But this was different. The darkness in the water seemed to have depth beyond measurement, as if the ocean floor had dropped away into an abyss that extended to the very centre of the earth. It was the ship's lookout, a sharp-eyed Welshman named Davies, who first spotted the true source of the disturbance. "Captain," he called down from the crow's nest, his voice tight with fear. "There's something in the water between us and the Spanish ships. Something big, and it ain't natural." Blackwood raised his spyglass and focused on the area Davies indicated. What he saw defied every principle of seamanship and naval warfare he had learned in 2 decades of Caribbean piracy. Rising from the darkened waters were shapes that resembled ships, but ships built according to no earthly design. Their hulls were translucent, allowing glimpses of skeletal frameworks that seemed to be constructed from human bones. Their sails billowed with wind that touched nothing else on the ocean, and their masts reached impossible heights, disappearing into low-hanging clouds that had appeared from nowhere. Most terrifying of all, these phantom vessels moved without regard for wind or current, gliding across the surface with the fluid grace of hunting sharks. The Spanish treasure fleet had also noticed the supernatural arrivals. Through his spyglass, Blackwood could see frantic activity on the decks of the escort frigates, as crews prepared for battle against an enemy unlike anything in their training or experience. The treasure galleon, Santa Isabella, was attempting to change course, but the phantom ships were already moving to surround it, cutting off all possible escape routes. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every survivor who witnessed it. The spectral vessels began their attack not with cannon fire or boarding parties, but with manifestations that challenged the very nature of reality itself. The sea around the Spanish ships began to churn with unnatural violence, forming whirlpools that spun against the natural rotation of the earth. From these whirlpools emerged tentacles of what appeared to be solidified seawater, reaching up to grasp the Spanish vessels with crushing force. But the true horror was yet to come. As the phantom ships drew closer to their prey, figures became visible on their decks. These were not the living crews that manned earthly vessels, but the animated corpses of sailors who had died violent deaths upon the Caribbean waters. Some bore the wounds that had killed them, gaping sword cuts and musket ball holes that leaked spectral blood onto the deck. Others showed the effects of drowning, their flesh bloated and discoloured, seaweed tangled in their hair and barnacles crusted on their skin. These undead mariners moved with purpose and intelligence, working the rigging of their phantom ships with the skill of veteran sailors. They communicated through means that transcended normal speech, their voices carrying across the water as whispers that seemed to come from inside the listeners' own heads. And their eyes, those terrible glowing eyes, burned with an otherworldly fire that spoke of hunger that could never be satisfied and rage that would never be quenched. Captain Blackwood faced an impossible decision. His original mission had been to capture the Spanish treasure fleet, but now that fleet was under attack by supernatural forces that made his own crew of hardened pirates look like children playing with toy boats. He could attempt to flee, abandoning the treasure and preserving the lives of his men. He could try to assist the Spanish ships against the phantom vessels, forming an alliance with his traditional enemies against a common supernatural threat. Or he could wait to see the outcome of this otherworldly battle and then attempt to claim whatever remained. The decision was made for him when one of the phantom ships turned its attention toward the Crimson Vengeance. The spectral vessel moved through the water with impossible speed, covering the distance between them in seconds rather than the minutes such a maneuver should have required. As it approached, the temperature continued to drop until frost began forming on the rigging, despite the tropical latitude. The crew of the Crimson Vengeance found themselves face to face with an enemy that existed outside the normal rules of naval warfare. The phantom ship's captain, if such a term could be applied to the thing that commanded it, was a figure that had once been human, but had been transformed by death and supernatural corruption into something far more terrible. His flesh hung in tatters from bones that gleamed with phosphorescent light. His uniform, which had once marked him as an officer of some long-forgotten navy, was now little more than rotting fabric held together by seaweed and barnacles. When he spoke, his voice carried the sound of wind through empty skulls and the crash of waves on dead shores. "You sail in waters that belong to the drowned," the phantom captain declared, his words seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Turn back now, or join our eternal fleet in service to powers that rule the deepest trenches of the sea." But Blackwood, despite his terror, was not a man to be easily intimidated. He had built his reputation on defying authority, whether it came from Spanish admirals, English governors, or the very crown itself. He would not bow before some waterlogged corpse, no matter how supernatural its origins. The response came not from Blackwood's lips, but from the mouth of his cannons. The Crimson Vengeance unleashed a full broadside into the phantom ship at point-blank range, 18 pounds of iron shot, fired with the precision that came from years of naval combat. The results defied everything the pirates knew about cause and effect. The cannonballs passed through the spectral vessel's hull without causing any visible damage, disappearing into the phantom ship as if it were made of mist rather than solid matter. But the phantom ship's response was devastatingly real. Spectral cannons along its ghostly gun ports suddenly blazed with otherworldly fire, launching projectiles that seemed to be made of crystallized screams and solidified despair. When these supernatural rounds struck the Crimson Vengeance, they passed through the wooden hull, but left behind corruption that spread like a disease through the ship's very structure. The wood began to rot and decay at an accelerated rate, weakening the vessel's integrity with every impact. More terrifying still was the effect on Blackwood's crew. Any man touched by the phantom ship's spectral ammunition found himself partially transported to whatever hellish realm the undead mariners called home. They would disappear for seconds or minutes at a time, returning with tales of being surrounded by the spirits of every sailor who had ever died violently in Caribbean waters. Some came back screaming about underwater cities populated by the drowned. Others spoke of vast underwater graveyards where the bones of ships and men alike were arranged in patterns that suggested some cosmic purpose beyond human understanding. The battle between the living and the dead was unlike any naval engagement in recorded history. Traditional tactics proved useless against enemies who could phase in and out of physical existence at will. Boarding actions became nightmarish affairs where pirates found themselves fighting opponents who could not be killed because they were already dead. Swords passed harmlessly through spectral flesh, while the claws and teeth of the undead mariners could tear living flesh with devastating effect. As the supernatural battle raged, Captain Blackwood began to understand that this was not a random encounter. The Phantom Fleet had been drawn to this location by something specific, something that went beyond mere territorial claims or supernatural hunger. Through the chaos of combat, he observed that the spectral ships were not simply attacking the Spanish treasure fleet at random. They were moving with purpose, concentrating their efforts on the Santa Isabella, the treasure galleon that carried more than just gold and silver in its hold. Thank you for joining me for this exploration into the supernatural waters of the Caribbean, where the line between the living and the dead became as fluid as the sea itself. What we've witnessed so far is only the beginning of a maritime mystery that would challenge everything the age of piracy thought it knew about life, death, and the powers that rule the ocean's depths. The Phantom Fleet's true purpose, the secret cargo aboard the Santa Isabella that had drawn their supernatural attention, and Captain Blackwood's desperate gambit to survive an encounter with forces beyond mortal comprehension, await us in the next chapter of this incredible tale. The Caribbean has always been a place where legends are born, but some legends are far more real and far more terrifying than anyone dared imagine. Through the smoke and supernatural chaos, Blackwood's keen pirate instincts detected patterns that his crew, focused purely on survival, had missed entirely. The phantom vessels weren't simply engaging in random destruction. Their movements followed a deliberate strategy, herding the Spanish ships into specific positions while maintaining particular formations around the Santa Isabella. This wasn't mere supernatural predation. This was a coordinated military operation conducted by forces that had once been human enough to understand naval tactics, but were now something far more dangerous. The realization struck him with the force of a cannonball to the chest. The spectral fleet knew exactly what the Spanish treasure galleon carried, and it wasn't just gold they were after. In his years of piracy, Blackwood had learned to read the subtle signs that separated routine treasure runs from cargo so valuable that entire fleets would die to protect it. The way the Spanish escorts had positioned themselves, the unusual route they had taken through these particular waters, the heavily reinforced hold visible through his spyglass, all pointed to a cargo that transcended mere monetary wealth. From his journal, we have this crucial observation. The dead do not hunger for gold or silver. These metals mean nothing to spirits who have passed beyond earthly concerns, yet they fought with the fury of the damned to reach the Santa Isabella's hold. Whatever lay within that ship's belly was something the Phantom Fleet needed, something that could affect their supernatural existence in ways that mortal treasure never could. The battle's intensity escalated as the Phantom ships began employing tactics that defied every principle of naval warfare. Spectral boarding parties didn't need ropes or grappling hooks to cross between vessels. They simply materialized on enemy decks, their translucent forms solidifying just long enough to engage in deadly combat before fading back into mist to avoid counterattacks. Spanish soldiers found themselves fighting enemies who could become incorporeal at will, while their own weapons proved increasingly useless against foes who existed partially outside the physical realm. But the Phantom Fleet's most terrifying weapon was psychological. As the battle progressed, the undead mariners began projecting the memories of their own deaths onto their living opponents. Spanish sailors suddenly found themselves experiencing the drowning deaths of pirates who had been keel-hauled decades ago. They felt their lungs filling with seawater, felt the crushing pressure of the ocean depths, felt the terror of sinking into darkness while still breathing air on the surface of the sea. Captain Blackwood's crew aboard the Crimson Vengeance was not immune to these supernatural assaults. His gunner, a veteran named Morrison, who had served in naval battles from Jamaica to Cartagena, suddenly collapsed screaming about sharks tearing his legs apart, reliving the death of some unknown sailor whose spirit now served in the Phantom Fleet. The ship's cook began babbling about being burned alive in a ship's magazine explosion, his hands clawing at his unmarked skin as if trying to extinguish flames that existed only in the realm of the dead. The Spanish treasure fleet's resistance was collapsing under the relentless supernatural assault. 2 of the escort frigates had already been overwhelmed, their crews either dead or driven mad by the Phantom Fleet's psychological attacks. The remaining frigate was attempting a desperate fighting withdrawal, but the spectral ships moved with them, matching every maneuver while maintaining their inexorable advance toward the Santa Isabella. It was then that Blackwood made a decision that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. Rather than flee or continue the futile battle against incorporeal enemies, he ordered the Crimson Vengeance to ram directly into the side of the Santa Isabella. If the Phantom Fleet wanted whatever was in the Spanish treasure galleon's hold badly enough to risk exposure to the living world, then that cargo represented either salvation or damnation, and Blackwood intended to claim it for himself. The impact sent shockwaves through both vessels. The Crimson Vengeance's reinforced bow, designed for ramming enemy ships, punched through the Santa Isabella's hull just above the waterline. The collision created a bridge of splintered wood and tangled rigging between the 2 ships, allowing Blackwood and his most trusted crew members to board the Spanish vessel, while the Phantom Fleet continued their assault from the other side. What they found in the Santa Isabella's hold defied explanation. The treasure they had expected was there, certainly, chests of gold coins and silver ingots stacked in neat rows. But dominating the center of the cargo space was something that had no place aboard any earthly vessel. It was a sarcophagus, ancient beyond measure, carved from some black stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Hieroglyphs covered its surface, symbols that predated any known civilization, arranged in patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate. The sarcophagus was surrounded by an elaborate containment system that combined Spanish engineering with what appeared to be much older protective measures. Iron chains blessed by priests wrapped around the stone coffin, while circles of salt and silver created geometric barriers on the deck around it. Crucifixes hung from every available surface, and the air itself reeked of holy water and burning incense, as if the Spanish had been conducting continuous religious ceremonies to keep whatever lay within the sarcophagus dormant. But the containment was failing. The Phantom Fleet's assault on the ship had disrupted the protective circles, scattering the salt and breaking several of the blessed chains. Cracks were appearing in the sarcophagus itself, hairline fractures that leaked a darkness so profound it seemed to have physical weight. From these cracks came whispers in languages that had been dead for millennia, voices that spoke of power beyond mortal comprehension and promises that could corrupt the strongest soul. Captain Rodriguez, the Santa Isabella's commanding officer, lay dying beside his ship's unholy cargo, a Spanish musket ball from the Phantom Fleet's supernatural ammunition lodged in his chest. But as Blackwood approached, the Spanish captain summoned enough strength to grab the pirate's arm with desperate intensity. "You must not let them have it," he gasped in accented English, blood flecking his lips. "We have guarded this thing for 300 years, keeping it from those who would use its power to remake the world in darkness." Rodriguez's tale, told in halting gasps as his life ebbed away, revealed the true nature of the cargo they had been transporting. The sarcophagus contained the remains of something that had once ruled vast underwater kingdoms in the Caribbean, a being of such malevolent power that even death could not fully contain it. Spanish conquistadors had discovered it in a sunken temple off the coast of the Yucatan Peninsula, along with warnings carved in a dozen dead languages about the catastrophe that would follow if it were ever allowed to return to the sea. For 3 centuries, the Spanish had kept this supernatural threat contained, moving it from secure location to secure location, never allowing it to remain in one place long enough for its influence to corrupt the surrounding area. But recently, that containment had begun to fail. The thing in the sarcophagus was growing stronger, calling out to its servants across the Caribbean, summoning every drowned soul and phantom ship to aid in its resurrection. The Phantom Fleet had not appeared by chance. They were responding to their master's call, drawn by supernatural compulsion to retrieve the sarcophagus and return it to the deepest trenches of the Caribbean Sea, where ancient altars waited to complete a ritual that would restore their commander to full power. Once resurrected, this entity would command every soul that had ever died in Caribbean waters, creating an undead armada that could challenge the living world itself. As Rodriguez spoke his final words, the battle raging around them reached a crescendo of supernatural violence. The remaining Spanish frigate had been overwhelmed, its crew now serving as unwilling additions to the Phantom Fleet. The spectral ships were closing in on the Santa Isabella from all sides, their undead crews preparing for a final assault that would claim both the sarcophagus and anyone foolish enough to stand between them and their goal. But Blackwood was not a man to surrender treasure without a fight, especially treasure that promised power beyond anything he had ever imagined. The dying Spanish captain had spoken of catastrophe if the entity were resurrected, but to a pirate who had spent his life defying authority and challenging the natural order, such warnings sounded more like opportunities than threats. If the Phantom Fleet served this underwater entity, then controlling that entity would give him command over supernatural forces that could dominate the entire Caribbean. The decision to attempt claiming the sarcophagus for himself was perhaps the most fateful choice in Blackwood's long career of dangerous gambles. As his crew worked to transfer the ancient coffin to the Crimson Vengeance, the Phantom Fleet's assault intensified beyond anything they had yet experienced. Spectral cannons fired projectiles made of crystallized terror that drove men mad with a single touch. Undead marines phased through the ship's hull to attack from within, their ghostly blades leaving wounds that would never heal properly. Most terrifying of all, the Phantom Fleet's commander, that dreadful figure whose very presence had frozen the blood of hardened pirates, began manifesting physically aboard the Santa Isabella. No longer content to direct the battle from his spectral vessel, he materialized directly in the treasure galleon's hold, his supernatural form radiating cold and despair with such intensity that frost began forming on the wooden bulkheads, despite the tropical climate. The Phantom Commander's physical manifestation aboard the Santa Isabella transformed the supernatural battle into something far more personal and terrifying. Standing nearly 8 feet tall, his form wavered between solid flesh and translucent mist, as if reality itself couldn't decide whether he truly existed. Seaweed hung from his skeletal frame like a rotting naval uniform, while barnacles had grown through the empty sockets where his eyes should have been. When he moved, the sound of rushing water followed him, as if the ocean itself was trapped within his undead form. Captain Bartholomew Blackwood found himself face to face with an entity that had commanded the seas when his grandfather's grandfather was still learning to walk. The Phantom Commander's voice, when it came, carried the authority of countless battles fought in waters that no longer appeared on any living cartographer's map. You dare to touch what belongs to the depths, mortal captain. You would steal from those who ruled these waters before your kind learned to build rafts. But Blackwood had not survived 20 years of Caribbean piracy by backing down from intimidating enemies, regardless of their supernatural origins. Drawing his cutlass, a blade that had tasted the blood of Spanish admirals and English governors alike, he positioned himself between the Phantom Commander and the ancient sarcophagus. "I've taken treasure from kings and emperors," he snarled, his voice steady despite the supernatural cold that was turning his breath to vapor. "One more dead admiral won't make much difference to my collection." The battle that followed defied every principle of swordplay that Blackwood had learned during his years of piracy. His opponent moved with inhuman speed, the phantom blade in his skeletal hand cutting through the air with the sound of screaming wind. When their weapons clashed, sparks of supernatural fire erupted from the impact, and Blackwood felt the cold of the deepest ocean trenches travel up his arm with each parry. The Phantom Commander fought with the accumulated skill of centuries spent in naval combat, his techniques drawn from forgotten schools of swordplay that had died with the civilizations that created them. He wielded his spectral blade with the fluid grace of moving water, each attack flowing into the next like an unstoppable tide. But Blackwood possessed something his undead opponent had lost in death: the unpredictable creativity that came from still being fully alive. Where the Phantom Commander's attacks followed the rigid patterns of formal dueling, Blackwood fought with the dirty tricks and improvised tactics that had kept him alive in dozens of desperate boarding actions. He threw handfuls of the scattered salt from the broken protective circles into his opponent's face, used the ship's rigging to swing around behind the Phantom Commander, and even attempted to use one of the blessed crucifixes as a makeshift shield. The supernatural duel raged across the Santa Isabella's hold while Blackwood's crew struggled to move the ancient sarcophagus to their own vessel. The task was proving more difficult than anticipated, not merely because of the stone coffin's tremendous weight, but because it seemed to resist being moved, as if some force within was anchoring it to its current location. Every few feet, the pirates would find their progress halted by invisible barriers that required tremendous effort to overcome. Meanwhile, the Phantom Fleet's assault on both ships continued with relentless intensity. Spectral boarding parties materialized throughout the vessels, engaging Blackwood's remaining crew in desperate combat that tested every survival skill they had learned during their criminal careers. The undead Marines fought with weapons forged from crystallized seawater and tempered in the fires of underwater volcanoes, blades that could cut through steel but left wounds that burned with the cold of the ocean depths. The pirate crew's situation grew increasingly desperate as more of their comrades fell to the Phantom Fleet's supernatural weapons. Those struck by spectral blades didn't simply die, they were partially pulled into whatever hellish realm the undead mariners inhabited, existing in a state between life and death that was arguably worse than either. Their screams echoed from dimensions that living ears were never meant to hear, while their bodies remained behind as empty shells that moved with the jerky motions of poorly controlled puppets. But it was during the height of this chaos that Blackwood made a discovery that would change the nature of the entire encounter. As he dueled with the Phantom Commander, his cutlass struck one of the cracks in the ancient sarcophagus. The impact sent shockwaves through both the physical and supernatural realms, causing every undead mariner aboard both ships to suddenly freeze in place, as if paralyzed by some unseen force. The voice that emerged from within the sarcophagus was unlike anything Blackwood had ever heard. It spoke in harmonics that seemed to resonate from multiple dimensions simultaneously. words that bypassed the ears entirely and spoke directly to the listener's soul. The language was ancient beyond measure, predating human civilization by eons, yet somehow its meaning was perfectly clear to everyone present. "I have waited so long," the voice whispered with the patience of geological ages, "waited through centuries of imprisonment, watched through the eyes of my servants as the surface world changed beyond recognition. But now the barriers weaken, and I can sense the one who would be my liberator standing so close to my prison." The Phantom Commander, who had been locked in deadly combat with Blackwood just moments before, suddenly ceased his attack and prostrated himself before the sarcophagus. His spectral form trembled with what might have been religious ecstasy as he addressed the entity within. "My lord, we have come as you commanded. The barriers that held you are failing, and we have driven off those who would keep you contained. Soon you will walk the ocean floors once again, and all who sail these waters will serve your eternal will." But the voice from the sarcophagus seemed less interested in the Phantom Commander's devotion than in the living pirate who stood defiantly beside the ancient prison. "Such interesting thoughts you carry, Captain Blackwood," the entity mused, its attention turning toward the pirate with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "You do not fear the supernatural as these Spanish fools did. You see opportunity where others see only terror. Perhaps we might reach an understanding that benefits us both." The offer that followed would have tempted the most virtuous saint and utterly corrupted the weakest sinner. The entity within the sarcophagus promised Blackwood dominion over every body of water in the Caribbean, command of supernatural forces that could sink entire naval fleets with a thought, and access to treasures that had been accumulating on the ocean floor for millennia. All he had to do was complete the ritual that would break the remaining containments and allow the ancient being to return to full power. The Phantom Fleet would become his to command, an armada of spectral vessels that could appear and disappear at will, striking at enemies who would never see them coming. Every pirate, privateer and naval officer who had died in Caribbean waters would serve as his crew, their accumulated knowledge and skills placed at his disposal. The very sea itself would become his ally, creating favourable winds for his ships while summoning terrible storms to destroy his enemies. More tempting still were the promises of knowledge that transcended anything available to mortal minds. The entity had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations that had ruled the Caribbean long before European explorers arrived. It had seen the construction of underwater cities whose architectural principles could revolutionize engineering, observed the development of supernatural technologies that made gunpowder seem like a child's toy, and accumulated secrets that could grant effective immortality to those worthy of receiving them. Captain Blackwood found himself genuinely considering the offer, his pirate's instincts warring with whatever remained of his humanity. The logical part of his mind recognized that accepting such power would likely damn his soul for eternity, transforming him into something as monstrous as the Phantom Commander who knelt before the sarcophagus. But the ambitious part of his nature, the drive that had led him to reject civilized society and embrace the dangerous freedom of piracy, whispered that this might be his only chance to transcend the limitations of mortal existence. The decision was complicated by the deteriorating situation around them. The Phantom Fleet's assault had effectively destroyed both the Santa Isabella and much of the Crimson Vengeance. The Spanish treasure galleon was taking on water through multiple breaches in its hull, while fires burned unchecked throughout its superstructure. Blackwood's own ship was in little better condition, its masts shattered by spectral cannon fire, and its crew reduced to fewer than a dozen survivors. Even if he rejected the entity's offer, the chances of escaping this supernatural encounter alive seemed increasingly remote. The Phantom Fleet showed no signs of allowing any witnesses to survive, and their supernatural weapons had proven devastatingly effective against conventional naval defenses. Perhaps accepting the ancient being's bargain was the only way to save what remained of his crew, even if it meant sacrificing his own humanity in the process. The entity seemed to sense his internal struggle, its voice taking on tones of seductive persuasion that made even the Phantom Commander's devotion seem lukewarm by comparison. "You have already chosen to live outside the laws of civilized society," it pointed out with undeniable logic. "You have killed, stolen, and terrorized innocent merchants for your own profit. How different would serving my interests be from serving your own? At least under my patronage, your crimes would serve a purpose greater than mere personal enrichment." But as Blackwood wavered on the edge of accepting this diabolic bargain, he noticed something that gave him pause. The Phantom Commander, despite his apparent devotion to the entity in the sarcophagus, was showing subtle signs of resistance to his master's will. The spectral figure's skeletal hands trembled, not with religious ecstasy, but with the effort of maintaining control over his own actions. His glowing eye sockets flickered with what might have been desperate intelligence trying to break through supernatural compulsion. The realization struck Blackwood like a lightning bolt. The Phantom Commander had once been human, perhaps even a pirate captain much like himself, who had made a similar bargain with the entity centuries ago. The supernatural servitude that appeared so magnificent when viewed from outside was actually a form of eternal imprisonment, trapping the soul in undead flesh while forcing it to serve interests that violated everything it had once held dear. The entity's promises of power and dominion were lies, or at best half-truths, that concealed a far more sinister reality. Accepting its offer wouldn't make Blackwood a supernatural emperor ruling the Caribbean seas. It would make him another puppet dancing to the whims of an ancient evil that viewed human consciousness as nothing more than a convenient tool for achieving its own incomprehensible goals. Armed with this understanding, Blackwood made his choice. Rather than accept the entity's bargain or attempt to flee from its supernatural servants, he would find a third option that neither the ancient evil nor its phantom fleet had anticipated. If the Spanish had managed to contain this creature for 3 centuries, then there must be methods available for extending that imprisonment indefinitely. The protective measures surrounding the sarcophagus had been disrupted by the battle, but they had not been completely destroyed. The pirate captain began backing away from the ancient prison, his cutlass still drawn but no longer pointed at the Phantom Commander. Instead, he began studying the scattered remains of the Spanish containment system, looking for patterns and principles that might be reassembled into an effective supernatural prison. The blessed chains could be rewrapped around the sarcophagus. The salt circles could be redrawn using supplies from the ship's stores. The crucifixes could be repositioned to recreate whatever geometric configuration the Spanish had used to keep their supernatural prisoner dormant. The entity's voice turned from seductive persuasion to frustrated anger as it realized what Blackwood was attempting. "You dare to defy me, mortal. You would choose continued servitude to laws that mean nothing to beings like myself. I have offered you everything your ambitious heart desires, and you respond with this pathetic attempt to restore my prison." But Blackwood had made his decision, and no amount of supernatural intimidation would change it. "I've spent my entire adult life fighting authority," he replied, beginning to gather the scattered components of the containment system. "Why should I start taking orders from some underwater dictator just because he's been dead longer than most?" The Phantom Commander's reaction to Blackwood's defiance was immediate and terrifying. The spectral figure's form solidified with supernatural rage, his ethereal blade becoming as real and deadly as any forged steel. But something had changed in his undead features. For the first time since materializing aboard the Santa Isabella, the Phantom Captain's glowing eye sockets flickered with what appeared to be approval, even gratitude, for Blackwood's rejection of his master's offer. "You understand now," the Phantom Commander whispered, his voice carrying across dimensions with desperate urgency. "I was Captain Eduardo Vasquez once, master of the fastest frigate in the Spanish Main. 300 years ago, I made the same choice you almost made. The power it promised was real, but the price was everything that made existence worthwhile." The ancient entity's fury at this betrayal by its own servant shook both vessels with supernatural force. The sarcophagus began cracking more severely, hairline fractures spreading across its surface like spiderwebs. From these growing fissures poured darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour the very concept of light. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the tropical air began crystallizing into ice, while the sea around both ships turned black as midnight despite the blazing Caribbean sun overhead. Blackwood worked frantically to restore the Spanish containment system, his fingers numb from supernatural cold as he rewrapped blessed chains around the deteriorating sarcophagus. The Phantom Commander, freed from his master's compulsion by some force stronger than ancient curses, began assisting with the desperate repair work. Together, the living pirate and the undead Spanish captain fought against time and supernatural corruption to prevent something far worse than death from escaping into the world. The ritual binding the entity required precise geometric arrangements that had been developed through centuries of careful study by Spanish scholars and priests. Each component had to be placed according to mathematical principles that incorporated both earthly physics and supernatural laws that governed interactions between the living and the dead. A single misplaced crucifix or incorrectly drawn salt circle could render the entire containment system useless. As they worked, the Phantom fleet began to change. Without their master's direct control, some of the spectral vessels started flickering in and out of existence, their undead crews struggling against centuries of supernatural compulsion. A few Phantom ships simply vanished, their crews finally finding the rest that had been denied them for so long. Others remained, but their attacks became less coordinated, more desperate, as if they were fighting against their own nature, with every spectral cannon shot fired. The entity within the sarcophagus unleashed its final gambit as the containment system neared completion. It began projecting visions directly into Blackwood's mind, showing him glimpses of the power he was rejecting. He saw himself commanding fleets of supernatural vessels that could travel beneath the waves as easily as above them. He witnessed treasure vaults on the ocean floor that contained wealth beyond the dreams of any mortal pirate. He experienced the intoxicating sensation of wielding power that could reshape reality itself according to his will. But these visions came with a price that the entity could not conceal. Behind every image of power and glory lurked the truth that Captain Vasquez had discovered too late. The supernatural abilities came with complete loss of free will. The incredible wealth was meaningless to beings who could no longer experience human pleasure. The ability to reshape reality was hollow when that reality became nothing more than an extension of the ancient evil's alien desires. The final component of the containment ritual required something that neither the Spanish nor the Phantom Commander could provide. It needed a willing sacrifice from someone who had genuinely rejected the entity's offer despite understanding its full magnitude. The binding required a soul that had chosen humanity over power, mortality over immortality, freedom over supernatural dominion. Captain Bartholomew Blackwood, the most successful pirate in the Caribbean, the man who had defied every authority from Spanish admirals to English kings, made his last and greatest act of rebellion against the ultimate power that sought to claim him. He placed his hands on the restored containment system and spoke the words that Captain Vasquez whispered to him. Words in a language older than human civilization, but somehow perfectly comprehensible to anyone who had chosen sacrifice over selfish gain. The ancient sarcophagus sealed itself with a sound like the closing of massive stone doors echoing across eternity. The cracks in its surface melted together like healing wounds, while the darkness that had been leaking from within was drawn back into whatever dimension had spawned it. The supernatural cold began to fade, replaced by the familiar warmth of Caribbean sunshine, breaking through clouds that were already dissipating. The Phantom Fleet's final moments were almost peaceful. One by one, the spectral vessels faded from the physical realm, their undead crews finally released from centuries of supernatural bondage. Captain Vasquez was the last to depart, his form becoming translucent as the binding that had held him to the mortal world weakened and broke. "Thank you," he said to Blackwood as he began to fade. "You have given us something we thought was lost forever. You have given us rest." The Phantom Commander's final act was to transfer the knowledge of the containment system to Blackwood's mind, ensuring that if the entity ever began to stir again, there would be someone in the living world capable of renewing its prison. Captain Blackwood survived the encounter, but he was forever changed by it. The few members of his crew who had lived through the supernatural battle spread tales of their captain's final act of piracy, stealing not treasure, but the very concept of supernatural dominion from an ancient evil that had ruled the Caribbean depths for millennia. The Crimson Vengeance limped back to Tortuga with its cargo hold empty of gold but heavy with knowledge that would prove more valuable than any treasure. Blackwood never sailed again after that day, instead establishing a secret organization dedicated to monitoring supernatural threats throughout the Caribbean. The Shadow Legion, as it came to be known, continues its work to this day, ensuring that some powers remain buried beneath the waves where they belong. The ancient sarcophagus was returned to Spanish custody, where it remains under constant guard in a location known only to a select few. But sometimes, on nights when the moon is dark and the sea runs black as ink, fishermen still report seeing phantom ships on the horizon, spectral vessels crewed by the Grateful Dead who remember a pirate captain's choice to save the world by rejecting everything he had ever wanted. Thank you for joining Dr. Whisper of War for this exploration of the Caribbean's most terrifying naval encounter. The story of Captain Blackwood and the Shadow Legion reminds us that true power often lies not in what we choose to take, but in what we choose to give up. In the endless struggle between light and darkness, sometimes the greatest victories come from those who refuse to win at any cost. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of supernatural warfare where the fate of the world hangs in the balance, and the most unlikely heroes emerge from the shadows of history itself.